Have you ever wondered how to create images that have a really out of focus background or a really out of focus foreground? Well, this assignment will introduce the concept of how to work with aperture, which is the opening in your lens, and how to decide which aperture to choose to create the effect that you want for your images. In this video, we're talking about the themed assignment. And the important thing to keep in mind with a themed assignment is the core principle is depth of field. And to simplify the definition of depth of field is the comparison of objects near to far in a given view. You probably remembered from some of the other videos you watched in class that depth of field is altered in your image by the aperture that you choose. And remember, the aperture is the size of the opening in your lens. So with this chart right here, you can see that the larger the opening in the lens, the more shallow your depth of field is going to be. So obviously a portion of your image is going to be really blurry if you've got a really wide opening. And as you gradually close down the opening in your lens, you're going to gain more and more depth in that area of focus. So when we say depth of field, we're talking about how much is in focus, and that's always a comparison from what's in focus to what's not in focus. So if I keep going with my aperture here, f11 is the smallest one that's listed here, but if I continue in that direction, I would go to f16, f22, and so on and so on. So the smaller the opening in the lens, the more range of focus. Now, if you're wondering, why is the small opening assigned to the bigger number? Shouldn't the bigger opening have a bigger f number? So the thing to remember with aperture and depth of field is that it's a ratio. And you may have picked this up from one of the other videos, but it's a ratio of the focal length of the lens to the size of the opening in the lens. If we were to think of these as fractions, the f doesn't literally stand for fraction, but if we thought of them as fractions, we know that 1 over 11 is a lot smaller than, let's say, 1 over 2. So 1/2 obviously would be the bigger fraction. So if you do think of them as ratios and you do associate f with fraction, then that's a good way to keep in mind why the smaller opening is assigned to what looks like the bigger number. Okay, so in this image you can really see a very shallow depth of field. You can see a horizontal section of the image that's very much in focus, and everything else is extremely out of focus. So we definitely call this shallow depth of field, but we could assume because of the limited area of focus that this is a really wide aperture. In this image, we're comparing three different apertures and the range of focus associated with each one. So the first one, the f2.8, has the widest opening in the lens and also has the most limited area of focus. You can see where in each one of the images, the critical plane of focus is determined by the blue line, and that's where the focus was actually placed on the subject. So from that point, the depth of field is extending. It's extending longer and longer the more we close down that aperture. So the smaller the aperture, the more range and focus from foreground to background, starting from that critical plane of focus. Another interesting note about the critical plane of focus was if something were to step into the frame next to that subject, we're talking about directly to the left or to the right, then that also would be in focus. So the thing that determines that is the angle of the camera. And if you'll notice, the angle of the camera is parallel to the subject. So as long as the camera is parallel to the subject, anything to the left or to the right of the subject is going to be in focus on into infinity. We could say that depth of field is the area of focus that falls 1/3 in front of and 2/3 behind the critical plane of focus. And remember, the critical plane of focus is determined by the angle of the camera. So we're dealing with 1/3 in front of and 2/3 behind where we place the focus, because we're always placing our focus on that critical plane of focus. Now, we've already briefly mentioned that it's affected by lens aperture. We're talking about an aperture that's wider, that's, has a greater opening in it, is going to produce a more shallow depth of field. An aperture that's smaller, going to gain more depth of field as far as area of focus. Lens to subject distance. If you were to flip back and look at the images that I showed you previously, you would decide that the camera is fairly close to the blades of grass, and because of that, it's able to produce a very shallow depth of field. The background is very out of focus because we're closer to the object. Or think of it this way, if you've got a zoom lens, you can zoom into the subject. Now, the focal length of the lens, the shorter the lens, the greater the depth of field. And we're thinking about that as well a little bit later in one of the slides that we'll see. But imagine if you're a portrait photographer, you may have a zoom lens and you want to zoom into your subject to create that very shallow depth of field. So it's that same idea that longer lens is going to be able to make the appearance of a more exaggerated shallow depth of field. So as we move into dealing with a themed assignment, now the themed assignment is primarily a depth of field assignment, and remember that's a comparison from foreground to background objects. We want to think about having a defined foreground and a defined background. That's really going to be key for this assignment. I'm about to show you 3 examples of student work for this assignment. This first image, you'll notice that everything is in focus from foreground to background. There's a defined subject in the foreground and a defined subject in the background. The aperture that he chose to make this work was f/22. In the next image, you'll see that the focus shifts to the foreground. In the foreground, we're able to see that it's in focus, but the background is completely out of focus. The aperture that was chosen to make this happen was f5.6. In this last image, you'll see that the background's in focus and the same aperture was chosen. So here's some general guidelines for the assignment. We know we're going to need 3 final images. All must be raw file formats. And this is going to be important and I think going to be a lot easier for you guys because we're going to be learning to process those raw images. So don't worry yet about how do I process them in Photoshop, how do I make them a PSD, don't worry about that. All you need to do is work on photographing your images using your camera on the manual exposure settings, trying to work with manual focus as much as possible. Now it says there must be a theme, and this can be anything you guys want to use. It could be big objects, it could be small objects. You don't have to photograph the same objects over and over again like my example. That's just probably an easy, situation if you want to consider that. Move in close or zoom in. So the type of images that I want to see are like the ones that I showed you earlier, the ones that have the subject in the foreground or in the background that occupy a lot of space, so the camera has moved in closer to those objects. And my last bullet point is that we do need a clearly defined foreground background to create that comparison in depth. We want to make sure that one of the images has front focus with 5.6 or wider. The second image is going to have back focus with the same aperture, or it could go even more shallow, but the same aperture is fine. The third image is going to have everything in focus with f/22 or smaller. Some things to keep in mind: a low ISO on all images. Everything you photograph and you turn in for this class, it's all about quality. So if there is an option for you to move the camera into a more lit location or bring out a tripod, then that's going to be something you want to do. But keep the ISO low because that's what's going to produce better quality images. Also, you don't have to photograph the same object. I think I've mentioned that on every slide, so it just needs to be a theme, okay? Focus and apertures are very important. If you don't focus on the right thing, or if you accidentally had it on autofocus, that's going to be something that I may make you rephotograph the assignment. Distance to lens is very important. I just want to slow down and describe this situation. You're going to see it later on in the video when I've set up a scenario for photographing dominoes, but keep in mind that the image that is everything in focus with f/22, what you're going to need to do is probably back up just a little bit. If you're photographing an object on a tabletop like we saw in this video, then you may have to be possibly even 4 feet from the object to get everything in focus, and that's just because of the optics of the lens and the aperture you're choosing. So keep that in mind, that if you can't get everything in focus, it probably has to do on that image with the distance that you are to your subject, so something to be aware of. Some of you are familiar with the concept that a small aperture will produce a slow shutter speed, and remember that anything slower than a 60th of a second will require a tripod because you don't want to handhold it. So you may need a tripod for this assignment as far as at least the f/22 image. You need to place your focus 1/3 of the way in between your front object and your back object, and that's something that will be discussed later on in the video, so keep that in mind. The thing that I like about the dominoes is the fact that they are parallel to the camera plane. And I don't know if you can see the camera plane in the shot, but the camera
is perfectly vertical right here. It's not at an angle, it's not down, it's not back, it's perfectly level. So that's nice because with the critical plane of focus, that means that these objects right here that are also parallel are also going to be in focus. So that's a good thing. So if you have an action figure or something else that you're photographing and you're wondering why all of it isn't perfectly in focus, you might consider the angle of the camera and the angle of the object. So the way we've got this set up here, we've got the ruler here for a reference point. We're not going to be using the ruler in the last shot. I've also got my gray card, which I'm going to be metering off of in each of my images. So if you'll notice where this is placed, this is really important right here. The domino in the front at the beginning of my ruler, and remember this ruler is 18 inches long, so if we're remembering the definition of depth of field, it says that depth of field falls 1/3 in front of and 2/3 behind the critical plane of focus. So if this is my object that I'm referencing right here, then that means that 1/3 in front of it and 2/3 behind is going to give me everything in focus if I'm thinking about starting with my focusing point on the middle domino. So that's going to be my goal, is to get the object in front to be in focus with a shallow depth of field for my first image. Then I'm going to shift the focus to the background for my second image. I'm still going to have a shallow depth of field. And then for my third image, I'm going to set my focus here, but I'm going to trust that if I've done this correctly and I've placed a measurement of the domino here, which is 1/3 in front, and placed another domino in the back at 2/3 behind, if I have an aperture of f/22 or smaller, I can pretty much guarantee that everything should be in focus. So we're going to do that now. So in the first image that I'm going to be photographing, I'm going to make sure that this one right here is the one that's in focus only. I'm going to have shallow depth of field, so everything behind it's going to be out of focus. So on your notes page, it says that you need at least f/5.6 or wider. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up now on the camera. And you should have a really low ISO. So make sure your ISO is on 100 because the camera's on a tripod, so you don't need anything higher than that. So right now, I've got f2, which is fine on this camera. If yours only opens up to 5.6, that's fine, but it needs to be 5.6 or wider. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take my gray card, I'm going to place it into the situation at the same angle the light's hitting the object. So I'm going to go ahead and meter right there, and that tells me that at f2, I've got 1/15 of a second. I'm going to go ahead and photograph this right here. So go ahead and do that. And I always want to double check and make sure that the gray card does resemble what it looks like here, and mine does, so I'm going to be good. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on my domino in the foreground. I'm going to make sure that that's set up correctly. And sometimes what I do is I alternate and I just double check with autofocus and manual focus to make sure I've set it correctly. If you do use any form of autofocus, make sure that you're using the area focus mode selector so you can control where it's autofocusing. You never want to just let it do it by itself. So anyways, I've got that in focus. I'm going to go ahead and take the photograph now. Now what's interesting is I've moved the gray card and my light meter starts to jump. But I don't want you to be worried about that. That's exactly what we should expect to see because this domino and this right here are reflecting a lot more light than my gray card. So trust your gray card, set it up the way it should be, and don't change it. I'm going to go ahead and take the photo then. Okay, so everything looks pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to work on my second shot, and I'm going to get this domino in the back right here in focus. So this is the one at the very back, and everything in the foreground is going to have shallow focus. So I don't really need to change my aperture. My aperture can stay exactly the same, so I'm going to leave it at f2. Now a question I would ask to the class is, do you think that I need to change my shutter speed? Hopefully you're saying no, because the lighting is still the same. The objects are the same, nothing's changed. All I'm doing is just shifting the focusing ring from the foreground to the background. So I'm going to do that now. And if you're wondering why is she working with the camera in the dials rather than the focusing ring, I'm double checking, like I said, with autofocus, but I'm using my area focus selector. And like I said, I'm just shifting back and forth between manual and autofocus just to double check my eyesight. You don't have to do that if your eyes are great. I'm old, so I'm gonna do that. So I'm gonna go ahead and not change my aperture and shutter speed, leave everything the same. I'm gonna go ahead and take the photo, and I look at it and I can see, when I zoom in, I can see that everything's in focus in the background. Okay? So in the last shot, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get everything in focus from foreground to background. And like we said that focus falls 1/3 in front and 2/3 behind the critical plane of focus. So this is where I need to start with my focus. So I'm gonna go ahead and change my aperture first, and my aperture is going to be set to at least f/22 or smaller. Remember, that's really important. I'm gonna be checking for that. So f/22. And then I would ask you, if I were in class, I would say, what do I do with my shutter speed? Hopefully you would say I need to remeter because I just closed my aperture down quite a bit, so I lost a lot of light. So I'm gonna remeter right now. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and take another photo of this. Now I've got a really slow shutter speed. Really slow shutter speed. This may be something where I might even want to turn on my timer because I might be afraid that I might accidentally move the camera. But I look at my grade card, everything looks accurate. So now what I'm going to do is focus on that one right there. Okay, so everything's set up. I've got f/22 at 8 seconds at ISO 100. Like I said, I'm going to turn on my timer, just in case, so I don't bump anything. Okay. We're gonna wait 8 seconds and we're gonna see what it looks like. Okay, so I'm gonna zoom in, I'm gonna double check my work, make sure everything looks accurate, and it does. Okay, so that's how we do it.